Hello, wonderful person. Today is the 11th of February, and I hope everyone's keeping well. So, just thought I'd put out another little video based on something I'd watched. So, you're someone who thinks they're a person, and you're watching a screen about a person who you also thinks they're a person, who's using a screen to record a screen and present a simulated image that we didn't witness personally, but we merely interpret second, third, or fourth hand, and so on. The irony further being that I'm actually reading notes off another phone. So, the screen's arguably presented by Kubrick as the monolith in 2001, A Space Odyssey, both at the beginning of the film, during the blank screen intro and opening score, and also during the film. So you might want to check out Rob Agger's excellent video on the Collative Learning channel. So I'll leave a link in the text to it. The simulated nature of our lives highlights the absence of reality in watching a representation of something you're viewing a simulated event of, but you're not witnessing an event firsthand, but in this case perhaps fourth hand, as it's merely a representation of a person depicting it through a handheld device that I'm viewing, an image of somebody's presenting to me of an event that they also didn't witness firsthand. So I think it's worth consideration to perhaps stop for a moment to consider what that actually says, as it's something more like the concept that's presented to us in Inception of a dream within a dream within a dream. And each level of presentation or discussion is arguably yet another deeper level of the dream. Yet images such as the one I'm displaying frankly, they're a cruel yet sort of wholly ingrained aspect within our psyche. So I'm going to eventually try to explain how we've been programmed in essence, as Kubrick suggests, to actually somehow love the bomb and the threat of imminent annihilation at any given moment. And the bomb itself is just another metaphor, as it appears to have taken many forms throughout our history that we're presented with, yet it's a form that appears both relevant and recognisable to us. So back to the subject on hand in this video, the film Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. For me, this is Kubrick's magnum opus, and I watched an excellent video the other day by a channel called Breadsword, titled Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Paradox, which breaks down the paradoxical concepts of what it is to be a human that are raised in is perhaps what's arguably one of my favourite films. So I'm going to go through something of a preamble to arrive at the paradoxes that the film actually presents to us, but in my own logic I suppose this context appears to make some sort of sense. So bear with me and I will eventually arrive at where I'm going with this. As with many such films, we think we understand them based on our interpretations, only to then go and watch a video that dissects it, and we come to see that we've seen things on a certain level, and that there in fact are deeper levels. So consequently, our interpretation changes or deepens, which again brings us back to that concept of a dream within a dream within a dream. The film itself I would regard as a virtuoso masterclass that lays plain our paradoxical nature, yet I believe it's one that's truly stood the test of time. So Breadsword's video is excellent and it's really worth the watch, so I'll also leave a link for it in the description, and if anybody hasn't seen the film, it's well worth checking out. So whilst I might mirror certain aspects of his video, in making this one I'm going to try and dive deeper and offer my perspective on what I think the film says about our paradoxical nature as human beings. So I'm not aiming to provide a comprehensive breakdown of the film, rather more of an overview of the concepts it brings up. I think watching Breadsword's video just sort of further reinforced why I love this film so much. So the film itself actually features a number of fantastic characters, each of which I think sort of depicts aspects of ourselves and the other characters that we appear to be sharing the stage of reality with. Firstly, we've got the insane Brigadier General Jack D. Ripper, curiously interesting name, and played by Sterling Hayden. And the character sort of appears to loom over us something like the sword of Damocles and represents the ever-present threat of imminent destruction at any time. Ripper himself, his character, views communist ideals as having taken over the nation, and things such as poisoning by fluoridation as being an example of the impurity that's now corrupting and poisoning the core of a once great nation. Yet Ripper's character, perhaps arguably, represents something of a part of our destructive nature as human beings, and a wish to tear down those foundations that we see around us. Either that or the paranoid overlord who governs over us with the existential threat of death, and also how in turn that governs our very way of life and how we live ours. Next comes Peter Sellers' trifold manic genius, which I think in many ways hints at the dichotomous aspects of what it is to be a person, and the manifold nature of the roles we've played or lives we've lived on this stage. His character, Captain Mandrake, is a jolly, nice and quintessentially stereotypical British chap. Now there's a good boy. And I think it's funny how we still cling to a stereotype that's long since disappeared. Sellers also plays the role of President Merkin Muffley, who's an insecure, bumbling idiot, a supposed leader who's led by others. And also, Sellers plays the deranged, psychotic, and wheelchair-bound Dr. Strangelove, who the film's in essence titled about. And this character has more than a hint of Henry Kissinger. So Strangelove's a dangerously flawed utopian idealist who ironically posits a really bizarre and sordid sort of sexual fantasy of mankind surviving an impending nuclear apocalypse in a bunker with a 10-to-1 ratio of females to every male, just as Armageddon's about to ensure. The irony of which being that there'll be no people or world left in which this might happen, and he's just descended into his wildest fantasy, really. So the threat of the bomb actually turns him on, and hence, having been crippled, the actual imminent nature and impending sort of, approach of our demise metaphorically actually gets him hard, and this crippled man actually stands to attention, proclaiming, "Mein Führer, I can walk!" And his presence in the war room perhaps further hints that no side actually won World War II, or maybe even any other battle, as it was just all one form of cruel charade with a set of overlords playing chess with others against another side of the same coin in essence. Next character I'll come to is Buck Turgidson, played by George C. Scott, and I think he perhaps represents the paranoia, insecurities and vulgarities we have as flawed humans, particularly those within the upper echelons of power. Yeah, he's so blindsided that he's missing the bigger picture. And another character I'll mention is that played by Slim Pickens, which is just it's a great stage name. And he plays the role of Major Kong, who towards the very end of the film, just as they're about to drop this nuclear warhead, gives this paradoxical speech to his men on the bomber plane about them likely receiving medals for their valor and for standing in service for, ideals. Yet, ironically again, what world would remain actually to give medals out in? The answer being none. So, what are the paradoxes this brilliant film presents? Firstly, our existence. How did we get here? We likely shouldn't exist. If you look at how science presents us as living within this supposed Goldilocks zone and all the fine-tuned laws of nature, these are too fine-tuned not to be some random occurrence. And I think rather it hints at some form of creation by a creator, or that or we're in some sort of simulation. Yet, here we are, none the wiser as to how we got here, and supposedly made it so far. So, secondly, the film presents our hypocritical status, for the most part, as being walking contradictions. In essence, we're varying degrees of a mixture of the good and not so good. Our darkness, in essence, actually helps us to see the light, and I think if you consider it, despite the horror of watching this last 2 years unfold, I think, for some it's presented an opportunity for personal growth, yet for many it's manifested all their internal anger and how many of us thrive on this. That's something my friend Anthony, who's also got a channel on YouTube, knows. I'll leave a link to that as well. And he'd mentioned he found it really funny how he'd received higher views on videos where, he was slightly angry and maybe he titled it to suggest the content was as such. His channel's great, by the way, so it's well worth checking out. But thinking about it, I've seen many videos, particularly over the last sort of, couple of years and over the context of the time that YouTube's been a thing, where the subject matter is one of anger. And these appear to receive vastly higher views than those which are aimed at restoring some semblance of balance and calm to our minds, both individually and on a collective level. So, does this suggest, even within the truth community of seekers, that we also perhaps somehow love the bomb and are in some way turned on by the threat of our destruction or its imminent possibility? Are we looking for any opportunity to fuel the flames? I think, you can see why many of us arrive at this sort of perspective of nihilism, though whilst I'd suggest there's little point to many of the inane things that we're taught to prioritise or want in life, perhaps that brings us closer to some latent form of realism. Perhaps we've come to recognise ourselves and how we've changed over time, knowing that we're a mixture of the good and not so good, and that this is something we actually have to recognise and accept in order to truly know ourselves and understand others as well. So, whilst many won't, perhaps some leopards actually might be said to change their spots and evolve somewhat within a lifetime, striving to become a better person. But again, we can't truly know the outcomes or consequences of our actions, even with the best, of will in our heart. So many of us are so insistent that we're right and that others should align with our thinking, that we know best and our actions are right, when in essence we're pissing into the wind. So I guess that brings us to a major flaw within consequentialism as to, not being able to truly know what the outcomes of our actions might be, even when paying the greatest of consideration before acting. Perspective, eh? And we see our lives as fractions of time and not one whole life for the entirety of time in which we're said to be, in inverted commas. I think it highlights something of the problematic nature of aiming towards the maximization of good or goodness as an end in itself that's spoken of within utilitarianism. So whilst it sort of appears to be palatable at first glance, I think you could argue that this approach, particularly on a macro level, leads to a form of utopianism and how our lives are directed by such idealists. But again, this is another paradoxical rabbit hole of infinite recourse, in that there's truly no right approach that can make us all happy, neither on a macro, global, or a micro, individual, or small group level, as one man's freedom is, in effect, it's another man's poison. Which suggests, we have to see this point and perhaps let go of everything that we cling to in seeking certainty where certainties we'd most likely, like to see don't actually exist. And we're somewhat deluding ourselves to a degree if we think they are going to occur here. So perhaps again, there's no other ideal than bending your mind around the spoon, like the child at the oracle's house says to Neo. See that this place is just a flawed ideal. I think we expect others to do as I say, not as I do, in a hypocritical sort of manner. And we're terrible at taking our own advice, or in stubbornly refusing to listen to our own truth sometimes, or knowing what's best for us, or even the advice of others about the reflection that they mirror back at us about ourselves. So we end up sort of choosing to operate within unhealthy modalities, and then go on to ignore actually any good advice that we or others might have by largely fighting against it. Furthermore, I suppose there's likely no I in the sense that we've come to understand or think of, which I think likely hints at the possible fractal and or illusory sort of nature of consciousness. Yet we notice that we have to sort of drop into conversing as an I in order to be able to relate to notions of ourselves and others, which I suppose all sort of reinforces that appearance of an I. If you think about Facebook and social media and the encouragement to pursue approval, likes, or to be heard and acknowledged, in essence, we're being forced to accept neediness and not actually thinking outside of this towards the bigger picture of what's going on. Instead, we're actually being sedated by that blue pill that Neo takes in the fourth Matrix film, ontolofloxacin. Ontology being, in essence, like your world view. And we're sedated by this blue pill, into buying into the narratives of what's going on and how our reality appears to be shifting and changing. So, to the paradoxes within Dr. Strangelove that I know I've probably approached in a rather long-winded way. I think the first of which being our nature, which, as Breadsword states in his excellent video, are sex and war, though on greater consideration, is sex largely inseparable from an act of violence nowadays? When you think about porn and all this modern day fixation with BDSM, is this some form of like predatory impulse that we're being forced to accept? Some sort of pain or wound being inflicted upon us, to carry out either behind a screen thinking we're doing no harm to anyone when in essence we're hurting ourselves and participating in something that takes advantage of others, or even towards others in the act of sort of aggressive or violent lovemaking, which is, in some essence seeded by things like porn and this obsession with things like BDSM. So violent lovemaking in itself is something of a contradictory sort of logical misnomer. I think we can perhaps also add to this list of our sort of nature that, that striving for advancement or betterment, yet I think this is, it's arguable that this is only likely to the stage of bringing about our demise or destruction, be it on a macro level, globally, or a micro level in terms of this stage really aiming at getting us to self-destruct. And, this cycle of sort of advancement and destruction, perhaps it's sort of some sort of never-ending and yet further paradoxical cyclical loop, which I think in essence ends in a riddle as to how many times we might have already done this throughout history and might consider to do so beyond now into infinity. So Breadsword rightly sort of points out the ways in which scenes within Doctor Strangelove are filmed. They present to us something very interesting and that I think says much about the predicament that we find ourselves in here, in this life. So the world appears steady for those above us, and that's in the wide angle choice of film that's selected and its focus. It brings in essence everything into focus and not just any one character. So those likely who are above us, they see a bigger picture that we don't. So again, in a sense they're telling us but not telling us they're telling us. And all appears shaky and unstable for us, the average person in the film, which I think is exemplified by the scene where the soldiers invade Burpelson military base in response to Ripper's Endgame. And these scenes are filmed on like the handheld battlefield camera. So in essence that's us, shaky and unstable, blindly following the commands of others without ever knowing their agendas. All knowing that we might likely die, or that it's imminent, but following an ideal that's presented to us, often of which we have no idea, or just don't even question. Um, I think even when we do question such agendas, our lack of understanding draws us back to the supposedly comfortable familiarity of having somebody else to think for us, as standing alone and acting from our own core motivations is most definitely not encouraged nowadays, and even then it's far too scary for most people to contemplate or even click out of for long. you, we all know that life's difficult to say the least, but most of us, we aren't even our authentic selves. We're just actors on a stage who, for the most part, don't really have a clue who we are. Hence, I think we're prone to all manner of sort of tactics of manipulation. So, Breadsword is this video. It drew my attention to Strangelove's choice of soundtrack, which he finds very interesting. So it got me sort of thinking about it, and as he rightly says, it's interesting mainly due to there largely sort of not being much of one. Yet they're all sort of fascinating choices, which I think hint at the hubris of mankind. You know, that inseparability from sex, violence, and that cycle of advancements and our own demise. And he elaborates that much of the choice of music, say like that within the opening scenes, the piece of music sort of chosen, it's almost hypnotically sort of sedating in its sedentary overtures, and it plays out to this image of two planes, high up in the sky, one refueling another through this long cable, and it does, it insinuates this sort of gyrating sort of sexual motion, really, which is interesting. And the next piece he mentions is really fascinating, and it involves a melody, from different songs that all play out to the same tune. Johnny Comes Marching Home, Johnny I Hardly Knew Ye, and another one that came to mind, The Animals Marched On Two by Two, Hurrah, Hurrah, which is a song about Noah's Ark from my childhood that the Breadsword video sort of triggered a memory of. It's that. So, in essence, we see how different lyrics are played to the same tune, and thus relate to something of a dichotomous aspect of our warmongering nature, the feelings of loss and the despair at the absurdity and really, meaningless of war. And even in that, that sense of a romantic sort of notion of new beginnings. So, right near the end of the film, it's noticeable, to observe the two bombs that are displayed, one of which Major Kong sits on and plummets happily to his death as if he's serving some sort of agenda that he's been programmed to believe in an unquestioning manner, and one that leads to our utter annihilation. And these two bombs are inscribed, the first with "Hello there," as some sort of malicious response to the other side of the same coin, and the other bomb has "Dear John" inscribed on it. Hence, that second song about the pain and loss of war in Johnny I Hardly Knew Ye. And the third version of this song I've mentioned, the animals come on two by two, relates to that which perhaps follows our destruction, as we likely rebuild almost from scratch again. The final and perhaps most epic piece of music sung by the iconic Vera Lynn and a troop of soldiers is "We'll Meet Again." And I guess, whilst this could be interpreted as some sort of salutary message of hope regarding a life beyond this one, perhaps as in consciousness surviving physical death, yet where might we be said to meet, and how would we recognise each other again? Analogous maybe to the lives we're living. These are all sort of unknown questions that hint towards, some form of possible truth about the illusory and confusing nature of the lives we currently occupy. Yeah, how many times have we done that, eh? So I'd suggest whilst we can individually sort of draw hope from aspects of this piece of music, it also hides something of a yet further sort of hint about the paradoxical nature of what it is to be human, whatever that truly means. Human, man. Are these changing prefixes a hint of different types of living being and not just societies that rise and fall, or just purely different civilizations? Who knows, Or is this just how we roll? Rising, only to fall again. So I think this perhaps brings us to the riddle of how history, that high story or heist story, of how many times we might have been round in this cycle of destruction already and might continue to do so, like some never-ending recurring pattern, which, the story might alter slightly, but it appears to follow the same sort of trajectory and process of self-implosion, being looking at those technological sort of advancements to the stage of invoking our own destruction, which it brings me to an iconic line from Strangelove, spoken by, well, shouted by the president character Merkin Muffley, where Buck Turgison's fighting the Russian ambassador, and Muffley calls out, "Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room," which I think is perhaps one of the most ironic yet amusing lines I've sort of come across in film history. I don't know, it also, there's something about this all that brings to mind that scene from Planet of the Apes where Charlton Heston's character Taylor's seen pounding the sand at the end and agonising at the realisation that mankind destroyed itself and was replaced by another form of intelligence. That our stupidity or short-sightedness, it likely sowed the seeds of our own destruction. Though much of the lives we actually lead aren't our own, especially if we choose to play this game of snakes and ladders that we're taught to. So perhaps we've got to stand on our own 2 feet and get to know ourselves in order to decide to actually exit this charade or play our own version of the game of life, somewhat like Man in Black from Westworld, who he's portrayed as the bad guy when, in essence, though he's some sort of creator or stage manager and curator, he knows what the game is and he's come to despise it. Hence, he's seeking a deeper truth, something beneath the veneer. So, we've no true idea of our history, just merely the inference of it, and consideration of when we might come to a change or change our self-destructive nature and overcome this is, I think it's perhaps the ultimate problem of what it is to be human. And I'm not sure we can or will change this stage, as it'd have to want to change. So perhaps all we can do on this sort of micro level is maybe attempt to overcome our limitations as best as possible so as not to self-destruct. And whilst I think we arguably have immense power on certain levels here, and, recognise that we're being played like a bunch of suckers, it's the controllers and influencers, or the zuckers, of the stage who are in charge, here on that macro scale. So perhaps opt out and play on a micro scale, play the game you want to in, as best as you possibly can. I think though, a number of these paradoxes seem encoded, hardwired into the nature of the reality that we occupy. So whilst we might somehow be manifesting and continuing this game of charades, until we either stop playing the game, exit the stage and remember or come to remember who or what we truly are, or the parasite governing it does that which is least likely looking based on things how things are playing out, or it leaves and concedes whilst there is still some slim to nominal outside possibility, I'll admit. So I can't rule it out or take it off the table completely, but largely I think we're labouring under a miscomprehension of trying to change that which doesn't wish to be changed or isn't allowed to be changed. So maybe just leave it to do what it's doing and move on. Maybe that's the answer. I personally, I don't think in our truest form we are what we're told we are, human. More that we're merely trapped within some sort of collective dream of forgetfulness and memory wipes that we can't fully make sense of this, and I think this likely prevents us from leaving based on the attachments we form, and maybe that's how, through things like that and guilt, we end up subjecting and maybe coming back here, drawn back into another meat suit. You know, this is effectively it's a mask parade, and we're masquerading under the illusion, trapped within a prison like sort of Rubik's Cube of logical misstep after misstep, which is further dangerous. So I don't think we can delude ourselves that this place will bend to our will and change suddenly. We're just sort of labouring under that choice, like the red or blue pill scenario, where all that effectively highlights is there is no choice, merely just the illusion of it. And that in itself highlights many such paradoxes, I think, if we choose to look closely enough. So, does all of this, when viewed in conjunction, hint that the sort of absurdly paradoxical nature of mankind is some sort of riddle? So, whilst paradoxes can be or appear to be sort of inescapably harmful, maybe riddles aren't. They're just confusing or mind bending to decipher or make sense of in some way. So I'll leave it at that. Hope you're all having a good day. Take care. Bye bye.